Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger. Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. It's August 11th, 2021. We're just days away from the next major conference sponsored by the Schiller Institute and this one by the LaRouche Legacy Foundation to look at the effect of the 50-year anniversary of events of August 15th, 1971, which established Lyndon LaRouche as the world's leading economist, both in his forecast of that and his warnings afterwards. Helga, this should be an extremely important event, and I hope many of our viewers will not only watch it, but will encourage others to join us.
Yes, I think that this event will highlight the fact that Lyndon LaRouche is, at least in the transatlantic world, by far the leading economist who foresaw what was the implication of Nixon abandoning the Bretton Woods system by replacing fixed exchange rates with floating exchange rates, which set the direction in all the evils we see today: a pandemic, a blowout of the financial system, a general collapse of the cultural side of society. uh, it may be a surprise to many people to see all of these situations being a complex domain hanging together. But Lyndon LaRouche foresaw what this dramatic break was by abandoning a focus on the real economy, on physical economies of the actual universal principles of the universe, and replacing it with the systems analysis, cybernetics, the whole information theory, because he recognized what was the fundamental flaw in the theories of Norbert Weiner, of John von Neumann. And there will be many experts from all over the world who will speak to this on Saturday. So I think, you, our viewers, should really watch this, because if you want to understand why the economists of the world have been unable to predict the 2008 crisis, why they are completely helpless in finding even an analysis, leave alone a solution to the present crisis, then this Saturday event is an absolute must for you to see. This will be an earth-shattering event, and I'm not promising too much.
Well, the title is So Are You Finally Willing to Learn Economics? And I think it's important to note that it's sponsored by the LaRouche Legacy Foundation, which is pulling together the works of Lyndon LaRouche. And when you start looking through these titles, you see how astounding his life's work really was.
Yes, we are publishing all the collected works of my late husband. We already have published one very beautiful edition, volume 1. The second one is underway. We will digitalize the entire work so that it will be available for everybody who wants to study seriously physical economy, but also the many other areas of the very, very rich work of my husband. So this is a very important event for many, many reasons.
As you mentioned, was his forecast of the pandemic threat, which would come from a breakdown of the Bretton Woods system. We see exactly how far we've gone into the world of insanity with this latest report that came out from the IPCC and the UN Secretary General Guterres, literally crazy warnings based on the report. This is really going off the deep end, isn't it?
Yeah, I must say that UN General Secretary Guterres, who said some reasonable things sometimes in the past, this time he has revealed the fact that he comes from a systems analysis background, because what he says is just insane. He says this is code red, the climate emergency. This is the death knell for coal and fossil fuels. And there are only 13 years left to protect the planet from total destruction. So he is now on the same line like the Friday for Future crazy teenagers, and it's just not true. I mean, this is a model. The IPCC, which has a lot of opposition from even their own ranks. I mean, there have been recently members of this IPCC, starting from the Goddard Institute, NASA, the Italian scientists, many others who criticized the model. But the IPCC is just using a model, an algorithm. This has nothing to do with weather. It has nothing to do with climate, which is very complex. It's a model, and this model is completely fraudulent and leads to results which are absurd. There are many hundreds of scientists from Italy, from South Africa, Switzerland, Germany, Holland, the United States, moderate ones from China and Russia, who all oppose this view and say this is completely exaggerated. There is no such thing as a climate catastrophe. There are climate changes, as there have been climate changes for millions of years. And there are even scientists who predict an ice age to come. There is this Dr. Soon, I think he's from the Harvard Smithsonian Institute for Astrophysics. He said there are tons of data that we are going into a small ice age, and that for the next 3 decades, until about 2015, we will have a cooling period, and that will be much more difficult to deal with than warming of the climate, which always has positive side effects. So this is really an effort to, it's really an effort to give the argumentation for the mafia of the City of London and Wall Street by imposing a global eco-dictatorship, by imposing the Green New Deal, or the Green Deal as they call it in Europe, and ram through these data, but it's not being accepted. For example, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, he said that Australia will not pay attention to this. Australia has done enough on the climate, that he is not going to write a blank check for measures which will just be extremely costly, and that Australia believes in technology to deal with all challenges. And that was the same argument like Chancellor Kurz from Austria. He also said that technology and science are the way to deal with such matters. So I think this is very important that there is such an opposition coming.
There's also a very strong indication from India, the environmental minister, among others, that the Indians are not going to go along with this. They're going to continue going with coal. And their point is that they're not going to sabotage their development based on this IPCC report. This will have implications for the whole developing sector, won't it?
The argument the environmental minister Yadav is making is that if you don't take the total so-called emission from India, naturally India has 1.4 billion people, it looks very big. But if you break it down to the per capita ratio, then it is extremely low and actually below the average. So he says this is, he turns it around and says this is a glaring call for the developed countries who have used a too big share of this to actually impose deep cuts in their emission. But that India is not going to do that because of exactly the reason you are saying, that they are not going to hamper their development. And now there is a big freak out on the side of some of the people who are pushing that the Indians dare and other developing countries dare to not take the total emission, but to take the per capita emission, which naturally points to the fact that the entire developing sector is completely underdeveloped, and that they have recognized the scheme of this imposed eco-dictatorship, which would prevent the developing countries from ever having a chance to develop. So I expect that this will get stronger as we see, the time for the COP26, which is in November. I think this will become sharper and more accentuated. And I think we have a lot of time to discuss the fraudulent scientific basis for all of these models.
And one final note on this, we have in Europe from Italy, the whole question of forest fires that are developing, but apparently these are not developing because of climate, but maybe because of arson. What do you have on that?
Well, the Italian, I think it's the environmental minister there, he said that 70% of the fires, the bushfires in Italy, are caused by arsons or by negligence and accidents. And the anti-mafia responsible from Sicily actually said that there are indications that the mafia has caused some of these fires so that there would be entire areas of wasteland so that solar panels and wind parks could be erected as demanded by the EU Commission. So this is actually, if that turns out to be true, it would actually be, show how extremely counterproductive this whole debate is. And, obviously one has to ask similar questions for Turkey and Greece. And, also just one last comment on that, the so-called hysteria or the hysteria about the so-called floods in Rhineland, Palatinate, and North Rhine-Westphalia. This again has nothing to do with climate. It's a century flood, as they have happened in the 14th century, in the 17th, in the 18th century. And all you can say is that there was an utter lack of infrastructure in the Ahr Valley, for example. If you don't build reservoirs and you don't build the infrastructure to take care of such floods, and just don't pay attention it, or to only do environmentally favorable things supposedly to make the fish able to flow, to swim, rather than thinking about the people, then that is the result. It's also the result of the black zero of Schäuble, the idea that you have to have a balanced budget and you cannot invest in infrastructure. I mean, this is the real cost for future generations, and all this shows is a blatant negligence of the common good by, in that case, the German governments of the last decades.
And Helga, I assume you were pleasantly surprised by someone who's not always very useful, Theo Sommer, with his op-ed in Die Zeit saying that Germany should not give up nuclear.
Well, at least some people are not completely blind to the reality. What Theo Sommer, a staunch Atlanticist otherwise, points out that, this does not function, that by 2030, there will be a 40% gap in the energy supply because you cannot fill the exit from coal, from nuclear, with renewables alone. So he suggests that the exit, which is planned for 2022 from nuclear energy, should be postponed. And he points to the fact that on the planet there are presently 28 countries who are increasing their nuclear energy investment, and there are presently 400 nuclear plants around the world which all function very fine. So he says this should be enough for the decision makers in Germany to rethink this entire question. And I can only say, if he says something correct, then I have to say this is what people should do.
Now, a very interesting development is this situation in Afghanistan, where it appears that the war hawks who were responsible for these endless wars are saying that the solution to Afghanistan is to go back in and continue fighting. Obviously, they paid no attention to the seminar that the Schiller Institute sponsored about how to bring about a development solution. This includes the British defense minister and includes quite a few of the war hawks in the United States. This is extremely idiotic, isn't it?
Well, the idea, that you would remedy something with military means what the entire NATO, the United States was not able to remedy in 20 years, just shows you the poor thinking on the part of those who are proposing this. I mean, the Taliban is, on the offensive. They have taken many cities already. The Indian government has called for all Indian nationals to leave Ma'ar-Sharif. There is even talk, Kunduz already fell. This was where the Bundeswehr was. And there's even talk that, it may be a few weeks only until Kabul will also fall into the hands of the Taliban. Now, there is a huge geopolitical fight around that. The Pakistani foreign minister, Qureshi, totally rejected the idea that Pakistan is giving safe havens to the Taliban. But, what all this points to is, there has to be a different approach. You cannot solve it militarily. I mean, that is completely out of the window. And the only way how there is any hope to solve the situation is there is already more or less a united front by all the neighbors, the Central Asian countries, Russia, China, India. I mean, even so, there are frictions, but nevertheless, everybody has an interest that the situation in Afghanistan does not sink again into a production of drugs and terrorism. And the only way how you can stop that is there has to be an integration of Afghanistan in the Eurasian development of the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road. And, there has to be a clear united front among all the neighbors. And if the United States and the Europeans would join that, that is the only hope. And we have presented this program 3 weeks ago. And anybody who wants to look at, where is the way out, please look at this program because this is more actual than ever before.
And that's archived on the schillerinstitute.com website. Now, Helga, as we have been talking over time, the unwillingness to share the vaccines with poorer countries has led to new emergence of new strains and new diseases in the biological holocaust that Lyndon LaRouche forecast if there were no efforts to overcome the underdevelopment. This Congo virus is serious, but this could just be a harbinger of more things to come.
Yes, I think, we are seeing right now, it's not just COVID, I mean, all the anti-vaxxers and the people against COVID measures, they should wake up and see this is not just COVID. This is a much larger phenomena. We have now this Marburg virus eruption in Kenya, in Democratic Republic of Congo, other countries around Liberia. And this is, a virus very much like Ebola, a new virus, just a new phenomena. Then we have this fungus, which erupted in hospitals in Washington, D.C., in Texas, which is also, transmitted from person to person, a new phenomena. Then naturally the COVID is very much not under control. And, there are now people such as Boborg from Denmark who says, the biggest danger is a situation where, the super variant could emerge, which would make the vaccines obsolete. And he says the only remedy against that is that every single person on the planet has to be vaccinated. And, the COVAX program, which was supposed to deliver vaccines to the developing countries, did not work because it depended too much on donations. And therefore, he is demanding there must be a mass export of factories so that at least 50 countries around the planet have production facilities for vaccines. And I think that that is absolutely true. But more fundamentally is what the Schiller Institute has called for, namely that we have to have a modern health system in every country, modern hospitals, well-educated personnel, doctors, nurses. If you want to have modern hospitals with modern equipment, you need water, you need clean water, you need electricity, general infrastructure. And it is the collapse of the economies and the infrastructure in the developing countries which will be the breeding ground for new diseases if we don't undertake that task finally to overcome poverty in the entire world. And that is what is high on the agenda. And I can only say that we are still not at the point where the leading institutions would recognize that their policy of laissez-faire and colonial traditions have to be replaced with a serious development approach, or we will not get rid of this problem.
Well, that brings us back to what will be the importance of this conference on Saturday. This coming Saturday, August 14th, 9 a.m. Eastern Time, we're experiencing the end of the phase of the post-1971 system. And this is something which Lynn had been warning about and continuing, not just warning, but presenting alternatives. So how would you organize people to watch this and to participate and use this as a springboard to not just learn economics, but bring about a revival of the best tradition of physical economy?
Well, the question people should ask themselves is, why is the world in such a horrendous condition? And I think that the works of Lyndon LaRouche is the absolute key, not only to understand it, but also to remedy it. Because why was Lyndon LaRouche able, as the practically only economist at that time, to identify what was the break, what was the significance of what Nixon did? It was not just a small economic means; it was a fundamental break between, what was an incomplete system, the Bretton Woods system, which never was what Franklin D. Roosevelt had intended, because Truman and Churchill completely, watered it down and did not emphasize the key component of overcoming the underdevelopment of the developing countries. That never was part of what the actual Bretton Woods system was. But it did stabilize for about 2 decades the economies of the United States, of Europe, because it paid attention to some basic, physical economic realities. And Nixon threw that out of the window by introducing a form of monetarism, which was the idea that from now on you would just use um, algorithms to describe the markets. What Lynn had identified, what was the flaw of Wiener and von Neumann, namely, that they applied a system, which has nothing to do with reality. It's a model, and this model is being used today for about everything. It is used for, if you look at the speculation in nanosecond tacts, in tempi, which are nanoseconds, trillions are floating around the planet in terms of speculation. These are based on the same method of algorithms of very fast computers who run this kind of speculation totally independent of reason or criteria of real economy. The same is the case for weather. It turns out that the first person who developed such an idea for forecasting or predicting weather models was the same Norbert Weiner and I think also John von Neumann. So that is why the IPCC model is garbage. It has nothing to do with the complex reasons of climate, and it's just a model. This was the same garbage like the Club of Rome. in I think it was 1972, when they put out this program Limits to Growth. It was the same fraudulent model, leaving out the impact of technological progress on the productivity of the economy. That was what LaRouche had identified as the key. Human creativity, inventions, discoveries of fundamental principles, and how these discoveries, when they are implemented as technology in the production process, how they affect the productivity. This you cannot measure in terms of these models, and that's why the whole thing does not function. But you can go to many other areas and you find the same idiotic method being applied. For example, in the prediction of crimes, they have now models which predict in what street which person will commit a murder in 5 years from now, and therefore you have to build jail cells so that you can accommodate that. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not very much. I mean, this is insane. This has nothing to do with reality, and I think that is a fundamental discussion. If this is not being reviewed and remedied by science, true discoveries, true physical universal principles, there is no remedy, because you have an entire establishment which is following, like the rats following the pipe, the person from Hamel, and it will lead to an abyss, and people will plunge into the abyss following a wrong idea. Fortunately, not everybody is doing that. Russia, for example, is not doing that. China is not having the same insane approach. So a lot, if people talk about a systemic competition, you have to look, why is the West failing in so many areas? And that is what the Saturday discussion is about, but also an optimistic idea, because Lyndon LaRouche has provided solutions which the world needs more than ever today.
Well, I think that's a perfect way to end, to make sure that people do tune in on Saturday, this coming Saturday, the 14th at 9 a.m. Eastern. As you say, there's no question that we're in a systemic collapse. The question is, do we have the courage to actually learn economics and learn from the greatest economist of this past century, Lyndon LaRouche? So Helga, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on Saturday.
Till next Saturday.